Russia's been at war with Ukraine for over 33 months. Today we examine the military situation. My name is Julian Rubka, this is BILD Situation Room. And we start once more with the sensational images from Moscow. Yesterday, the Ukrainian Domestic Intelligence Agency successfully carried out an operation in which they killed the head of the Russian Nuclear, Biological and Chemical Defense Forces, Major General Igor Kirillov, along with his assistant in Moscow. It's quite clear now, as the SBU, the Ukrainian service, claimed responsibility for this. And here we see again the scene that led to the death of Kirillov and his assistant. So here's the house he most likely left from in the morning on his way to work. So this is the door he will come out of shortly. And right next to it, here is the e-scooter, which was just fitted with explosives, where the explosives were attached. About 300 grams, they say, which then exploded at the moment when the two Russian military personnel responsible for numerous, we can see it here at this moment, who were involved in numerous, especially propaganda acts in recent years that led to these two being killed. We remember Kirillov was the one who claimed, while we see another recording here of this massive explosion, who claimed that the USA bio weapons laboratories in Ukraine, which supposedly justified Russia's defense with their war of aggression against Ukraine. Furthermore, and as Ukrainian officials have clearly and consistently stated, was involved in the development of the TOS-1A, the thermobaric rocket launcher of the Russians, officially called a flamethrower, and this is also a weapon that has repeatedly been used against civilian infrastructure in Ukraine in recent years, leading to massive destruction. All in all, the SBU states, which itself has already or the GUR, the Military Intelligence Service, which was specifically targeted by Russian services. We remember the wife of Mr. Budanov, the head of the GUR, was poisoned in Kiev. However, the SBU, serving as the Domestic Intelligence Agency, claims it was absolutely justified to kill Mr. Kirillov in Moscow. Moscow at the time announced retaliations, stated that this was a terrorist act, and that Ukraine had thereby lost any claim to statehood. Something we've heard from Vladimir Putin for a long time, that Ukraine isn't truly a real state. So, no big change in the situation here. However, there's considerable fear and panic among Russia's elite now, fearing they might be next because, quite evidently, the SBU is capable of to deploy individuals carrying bombs and explicit orders to Moscow, aiming to target and eliminate Russian military members and potentially prominent Russian politicians. We'll continue to remain in Russia, focusing on the Kursk region located on the western border of the Russian Federation. Here, we'll closely examine the situation, which has been increasingly escalating over the past several days. Since there are thousands of North Korean, very important, yesterday we accidentally said South Korean once, they are of course North Korean soldiers, who are actively deployed here and are simply sent openly across the field without any sort of cover by the Kremlin and their respective commanding generals. And there are actually true massacres being committed here against the North Koreans. The Ukrainians here, with their unique sense of humor, have attached small Christmas plush toys to their RPG-7 warheads. However, and that's the crucial point we see here, are the completely unprotected North Koreans who are crossing the fields from point A to point B, from where they have been sent to the respective Ukrainian positions, and who are facing the Ukrainian kamikaze FPV drones are entirely exposed and unprotected here. Once again, it's clearly visible how numerous North Koreans are simply walking along in succession, one after the other. Not really in formation either. Sometimes we have the safety distances, which would be important. Here we see it. Sometimes we also have the situation here that 3 North Koreans walk in a row without keeping distance, and a single FPV kamikaze drone naturally flies right there to fly towards this target, and then presumably also to injuries and fatalities are missing. As mentioned, the Ukrainians here, with a very special kind of Christmas humor, have just attached these animals to their drones. However, what we see, and the USA has confirmed this, is that North Korea reportedly lost hundreds of soldiers here in Kursk within the initial 3 days of its offensive. The reports originate from the White House and align closely with what we can unmistakably see in the footage provided by Ukrainian sources. It's crucial to note that the North Koreans are only a part of the Russian offensive. Simultaneously with the North Koreans advancing towards Kursk, we also have additional Russian tanks that are also advancing in Kursk and trying there to reclaim the lost territories. Here we can observe different reports or a variety of detailed videos from the Ukrainians who are employing FPV drones yet again. They are showcasing detailed footage of how they specifically target and engage BMP-2 and BMP-3 vehicles, as well as the BMD-3 units, which belong to the well-known paratrooper divisions. How to attack them. And we see here that not only are the North Korean infantrymen being killed, but masses of additional Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles are also being destroyed in Kursk. This shows us just how large the offensive is and that the Russians are simultaneously deploy various units. We also observed yesterday that Iskander ballistic missiles are now being used against Kursk, effectively targeting their own country. This means it's extremely important to Putin. He sees this as a sort of countdown until the election of Donald Trump, or rather until Donald Trump's inauguration. This indicates that he is deeply committed to promptly regaining control of Kursk in a timely fashion just as Donald Trump is in office, before there is any kind of ceasefire and before Kursk becomes a bargaining chip for the Ukrainians to say we withdraw from Kursk, from Ukraine or something similar. All of this should definitely be avoided, and that's why it's so important to the Kremlin in the next just over a month. Today is the 18th December. Just over a month, aiming to reclaim the course entirely. Here we see another quite interesting Russian deployment vehicle, if you will. This is essentially a mobile bridge system. It seems to be an MTLB tracked vehicle on which they have constructed a certain kind of bridging structure. Because we are just at the beginning of winter, the Russian winter, currently still with a lot of mud and a lot of water. And here we can see that this is one of those rivers, the small streams and rivers that the Russian army needs to cross over in order to advance in Kursk towards the region of Sucha. We'll take a look at that on the map in a moment. Towards Sucha, yes, the main hub still held by the Ukrainians. And in this sense, such moving pontoon bridges are used here, which of course also being heavily attacked by the Ukrainian army accordingly. We now see here the wood on top burning relatively well on this, probably MTRB, it's not entirely clear. In this regard, the Ukrainians are also making efforts to advance further here in order to effectively destroy all the material that the Russians deploy, both in terms of personnel and technology, and to lose territory as slowly as possible. That's how it has to be articulated, because at the moment we are witnessing, and even the Ukrainians are acknowledging, that the Russian-North Korean offensive is so substantial that we're gradually pulling back in the Kursk region. As a matter of fact, several sections have already been lost in the last few days during this challenging period. We're observing that this particular area is gradually getting smaller and smaller. We can take a closer look at that here. East of Malaya Lokna is, we can see that the red keeps advancing further there. There, it's the North Koreans who are attacking. Meanwhile, we also have the Russian offensive, which, in recent days, Plekovo has been recaptured. Moreover, we have seen the striking footage of the mobile, versatile pontoon bridge system in action. And this represents another offensive that continues to steadily advance here and, for example, has successfully brought Darino firmly under control. And in general, as just mentioned, there is an ongoing attempt being made from the north, east and also the west to make significant advancements towards the region of Sucha. Sucha, the only small town still under Ukrainian control, and the Russians want it back. At any cost, to drive the Ukrainians away, pushing them back towards Sumy. Overall, we observe that the Russian-North Korean offensive is making steady progress towards Kursk from the southeast, the northeast, and also from the west. Their strategic aim is to decisively ensure that the area is brought back under Russian control within the forthcoming 33 days. We move a bit further southwest, heading into the east of Ukraine, specifically to the Kupiansk region. In that area, the Russian offensive against Kharkiv is attempting to capture and secure additional territory. We've said in recent days that it's essentially the East Kiev region. That means this natural barrier, if you will, that the Russians want to approach first in order to have a kind of natural border initially, and from there potentially continue further westward towards advancing on Kharkiv city. And we've marked this Eastern Kiev River here once more. So we see him quite clearly as he runs along here, leading through Kupiansk and then heading a bit further north. And south of Kupiansk here, the Ukrainians have constructed a new pontoon bridge themselves in recent weeks to ensure they can supply this small bridgehead located on the eastern side and to establish and maintain a presence there effectively. Bring in arms and gear, primarily tanks and infantry vehicles in order to prevent the Russians from advancing further here into Kharkiv, efforts are being made, and exactly. This pontoon bridge has now become the specific target of Russian rocket artillery attacks. We can see it quite clearly down here. We have the already destroyed original bridge on the right side and the still intact pontoon bridge, which the Kiev army has constructed right next to it. To supply his troops here in this area, we can now clearly observe how the Russians are deploying extremely powerful missiles. There we see it, to destroy this pontoon bridge, and the whole thing is a direct hit, as we can see. You can quite clearly see how it essentially falls completely apart, how this pontoon, this floating bridge, now breaks apart into its individual pieces and subsequently drifts off in various different directions. And the Russians are trying to do the same thing here, just as the Ukrainians are trying in Kursk. We've just seen it, the artificial bridges over the small rivers in Kursk are being bombarded by the Ukrainians, but with a much smaller caliber, namely what we just saw, FPV drones. Now we see on the other side that, and now it's gone, now you can see it quite well. We had the situation simultaneously, that in Kharkiv, the newly engineered Ukrainian bridges are yet again being heavily bombarded by the Russian military forces. Let's head slightly further south from Kharkiv, specifically to Donetsk, located in the Donetsk region, and the fighting continues there around various cities, and especially in Toretsk, it is the urban combat that has been ongoing for months, and the Ukrainians are trying to conduct it as a sort of rearguard action, with the goal of inflicting the maximum possible losses on the Russian forces while striving to minimize their own casualties as much as they can. We are watching the helmet camera footage of a Ukrainian soldier to truly grasp just how very dangerous this entire situation is. Actually moving directly into Torres, not engaging the Russians from afar with FPV drones or artillery or anything else, but genuinely being there on the ground and not fully knowing where the nearest Russian soldiers are, if they're in the next house or behind the next wall. In that sense, it's an extremely dangerous advance or an extremely dangerous defensive situation that the Ukrainians have to navigate here. We'll see the final briefing here once more in the quasi-safe house, at least knowing there are no Russian soldiers here before then. Just to head onto the street and then into the next house. And like I said, the situation is so dynamic that you just don't really know where the Russian soldiers are. Did they push forward further overnight? Could they be in another house? Is there a sniper, a sharpshooter, or someone with a machine gun just waiting for the Ukrainians to step onto the street? And so we see here how the soldiers run and how they are trying very quickly to move from the cover they just had. Unfortunately, a very shaky recording, but I believe you definitely grasped the idea. To swiftly reach the next cover, maybe the next building wall, where they are out of sight from various angles and therefore can't be easily targeted or shot at. We see just how extremely dangerous it all is, and that's precisely why Ukraine, unlike Russia, tries to prevent its soldiers from ending up in such situations. By making an effort not to send the soldiers forward, not adopting the attitude of, well, we'll just deploy 10, and if 7 of them perish, then at least 3 remain alive, to accomplish the mission successfully. This approach is unlike the Russian version, as they genuinely endeavor to protect the lives of each individual. This results in us having multiple times the losses of the Russian army. However, it also leads to the Russian army advancing further with this mass urban class tactic, even into Toretsk. And now we want to look at that on the map and see that indeed the Ukrainians who are trying to defend Toretsk city with few soldiers are facing the Russians who with many soldiers are attempting to capturing the city of Toretsk, that these Ukrainians are slowly retreating. And we're closely observing, and honestly, this orange zone shown right here has already been entered by Russian forces. This is actually a combat zone. And if we had a war now where the fronts shift in both directions, we'd have a war where fighting occurs and then the outcome is uncertain and you don't know where it's heading. Then you could say, well, there's fighting, there are still Ukrainian soldiers. It's possible for it to be cleared again, but practically the entire orange area, and regrettably we've seen this repeatedly over the months, turns red over time. And therefore we can, these areas marked here in red, in orange I meant to say, of course, we can already see as essentially occupied by Russia. The struggle is still ongoing. However, the direction in which the battles have moved in recent months is relatively clear, namely towards the northwest. And in that regard, Toretsk has gradually come to be over 70% under Russian control at this point. Ultimately, we'll be heading down south to the Zaporizhia region in Ukraine. Ukraine suspects that Russia is preparing another major offensive to prevent the 700,000 inhabitant state of Zaporizhia to conquer the city of Saarbrücken. Therefore, Kiev actively seeks to counter this by targeting a range of structures and a variety of Russian weapon systems that are currently not engaged actively in an offensive capacity in this particular area, are not yet on the offensive, to attack in order to destroy possible springboards from which the offensive can be launched. And we can see it right here. So we have extensive surveillance by Ukrainian drones along this front. And then efforts are made to destroy the occupied houses where the Russian soldiers enter and their weapons systems. This is obviously a very difficult situation for Ukraine. They simply cannot pull their people out. You can't just say, well, it's calm there, the Russians haven't arrived yet. Maybe the Russians don't have enough men to attack here, so we move the soldiers elsewhere. However, you also need to deploy very substantial formations along the entire stretch of the front here. Overall, yes, including the border, a 1,400-kilometer-long front between Russian troops and Ukrainian troops. And in that respect, it is very difficult for Ukraine because you can't just relocate the troops. However, as we can see here, the Ukrainian army is also trying to establish facts and make the best possible preparations for a potential Russian offensive towards Zaporizhzhia city, also towards central Ukraine. We have to say, to nip it in the bud here,